Welcome everyone to Mailfuzz TV. I am Peter and today I'm going to be talking about the X-Files Season 2 Episode 11. It's called Excelsis Dei. I think I'm pronouncing that right, but forgive me if not. Spoilers for the episode. This one is set in a convalescent home for patients that have got things like Alzheimer's and other degenerative diseases. And it's a very dark episode, at least to begin with. And I was actually kind of into the opening of it because it did a really good job of like having this long, slow, cold open where we get to know this nurse character who works at this facility. We see her interact with the other staff members who seem very just kind of aloof and don't really seem to care about what's going on. And then more importantly, we see her interacting with some of the older patients, in particular the older men, who makes, one of them makes some lewd comments and kind of wants a sponge bath and crack some jokes. And it does a good job of like really selling this idea that this is something she puts up with a lot. The way that she kind of sarcastically responds to it really feels like, oh, she's built up a thick skin by being around these dirty old men as much as she probably has for however long. But it also introduces the theme that that's kind of what we're going to be exploring this episode, is the idea that there is like a threat here that maybe wasn't taken seriously. And the end of the cold open is her being trapped in a room and, well, raped, but as X-Files, so whoever's doing it is invisible. So whether that's an invisible person, some kind of spirit or demon, whatever path we're going down, I thought, while it was very dark, and honestly, it feels much darker. I mean, even the comments between the old men and her, like when she kind of fires back with like, oh yeah, I love coming in and getting all these comments from you, it turns me on so much, or something like that she says. Even that felt a bit darker in a way than like any of the dialogue that we'd maybe had up until this point in the show. It felt like it was really sort of pushing to an edgy sort of level. Not necessarily a bad way at that point, but the fact that it ends with this violent attack, and it's like, okay, we're going to do something like the movie The Entity, which was about a demon or ghost that kept assaulting a woman and no one believed her until they did and started investigating it. That was the premise of a whole movie, is a ghost that was committing those kind of crimes. Sadly, I think this episode, the more it goes on and the more it unravels like all the other things that it wants to do, it kind of fumbles and becomes less interesting. And the worst part of it is that it feels like it doesn't take that opening assault, that rape, as seriously as it should. It feels like it's not as important by the time we get to the end. It's just kind of something in a string of other events, as opposed to what felt like it should have been taken seriously. And it kind of does take it seriously for a little bit. Like, I think one of the problems with this episode is that a few of the elements of it are kind of dated in some ways, and not just one thing. There's two specific things that jumped out at me. One was the writing of Mulder and his attitude towards some of this stuff, which I'll get to. And then the other one was kind of a more generic horror stereotype of like a foreigner with like foreign customs, which we'll talk about as well. Because what I did like about I thought the opening was effectively directed. I thought it was dark and it had atmosphere, and I was invested in the story and like solving the crime. It felt like it gave the characters Mulder and Scully a really nasty crime to solve. And on a sort of storytelling point of view, that was good. That was like, okay, I'm interested. I want you to deal with this. I want you to get to the bottom of this. And I also appreciated that Scully was extra motivated, right? And that she is like already, I love the play here where Mulder comes into the X-Files basement and Scully's already there watching the tape that's been sent in of the victim. He's like, oh, we've got X-Files on cases like this where people have reported phantom rapes or whatever you want to call them. And she's like, I know, I've been here since 6, I read them all. It really flipped the tables, this idea that Scully was the one waiting with the case, because normally she comes in and Mulder's like, hey, there's a new number or a new case. Not number. I'm thinking a person of interest. They get numbers. These two get cases. But I like that. I like that there was a little bit of extra motivation there. I don't think there's anything wrong with her having a bit more empathy towards the victim. After all, she is as the woman of the pair. It makes some sense that maybe it reaches her in a level that maybe it wouldn't quite reach Mulder. I don't think that's inherently a bad thing. However, Mulder is written in this episode, in the first half anyway, when it's primarily this attack that they're talking about, where he's actually dismissive. And what's weird about it is that he's never dismissive. He is ready to jump down whatever paranormal, supernatural explanation there is for anything, right? He's been like that since episode 1. We're halfway through season 2, and that is the consistent pattern on this show. And after they've been to the hospital or the home and they've talked to people and they're sort of theorizing what's maybe happening, Scully just floats the idea that there's something else, maybe this is less to do with the patients and more to do with the building. And Mulder scoffs and says, what, you think it's haunted? I think you've been hanging around with me too much. And that's an okay line on its own because it's kind of like a joke but whatever. But this scene where they're at the hotel, it really feels like she has to really, I won't say beg, but she really has to, like, come on, Mulder, can we stick around another day? I want to look into this more. And he's just ready to fly back. He's ready to say this is unsubstantiated. He thinks that none of these reports have ever led to anything concrete, so there's no point in hanging around. He just wants to move on, and Scully doesn't. And it really felt like a little bit dismissive from Mulder in a way that felt a little like, this feels... It's probably a trope, the idea to have the man be dismissive of the sexual assault and have the woman be a bit more understanding and want to look into it more. But it felt like they almost made Mulder a little too unlikable compared to what he normally is. Because normally, if Scully suggested, hey, maybe there's a haunting or something here, even if he doesn't necessarily think that's true, he'd probably want to explore it because he likes to explore that kind of stuff. But he's just ready to leave. So it felt strange, almost like they were shoehorning in Mulder's character. I think Scully, for the most part, is fine, I guess, in this sense, but Mulder's shoehorned into this role of being the denier just to make the trope of, like, one believes and one doesn't, one's the skeptic. But here, him being the skeptic makes him look quite bad, I think. At least for the first half of the episode. Once we actually get to the point where it's more about investigating the fact that all the patients are on some weird drug. They're actually on 2 weird drugs. They're on one officially, which is like a trial thing. And then there's a janitor who's giving them something else, which turns out to be a bunch of mushrooms that he's growing in the basement. Which, that's the other trope that kind of feels like it. They actually do say it at the very, very end of the episode when Scully's doing her outro and she's doing her report. She says the guy's from Malaysia. But before that point, they just say he's Asian, right? Which the first time they say it's not a big deal. They just say, hey, you've got an Asian guy working here, right? Can we go speak to him? Nothing wrong with that. What really stuck out to me is when they find the mushrooms, and more importantly, a dead body inside the dirt, which turns out to be nothing to do with him. It's just the ghost did that. I'll talk about them in a bit. But the way that they were talking to him, the way this character, Gung, which is his name, he kept saying, where I'm from, we have these customs. My country has different customs. He said a variation of the phrase "my country" or "my home," where I'm from, whatever. He phrased that like 4 or 5 different ways in the span of like a minute while he was talking to Mulder, Scully, and the head of the home, and it felt really weird. It felt like that thing sometimes where, like, they'll put in a script a character's visiting Europe, but they'll never say which country. Although I feel like they're more guilty of it with South America. They'll just say, oh, they're from Latin America. And I'm like, yeah, but Latin America's got a lot of different countries. It's not just one place. And it felt like they didn't want to specify. They did eventually at the very end. I was actually very surprised when Scully just said where he was being deported to at the end. But he kept just insisting that this was what they do for the elderly where he's from, and he didn't think there was anything wrong with that. This felt, again, very trope-like. This idea that he thinks he's doing a good thing for the most part, but it's actually like the mushrooms are like forming a link with the dead, and it's actually the ex-patients of this place who felt mistreated by the staff, and they're acting out because of that. But all of this doesn't really link up that well because a couple of the male staff members are a little bit snooty with the staff or with the patients. Like, they're a little bit like, come on, let's go now. They're not very, their bedside manner's not very good, and they clearly don't like their job. But I wouldn't say that they're mistreating them to the point where they deserve, like, violence and, and comeuppance, right? It doesn't feel like they're doing anything that warrants that. They should probably go find a job where they're not as miserable. But I wouldn't say they go across, like, I think it's clear, the patients clearly feel that they don't The male staff members don't like them, and that's fine, right? I think that is clear, right? They're not really hiding the fact that they don't like working here, and that maybe creates a bit of a shitty atmosphere. Like, absolutely. But does that deserve being pushed out a window and falling to your death? I mean, did the rape victim, did she do something that warranted that? I highly doubt it. Even if she did something bad, it doesn't warrant that, which is why it kind of feels like some of the things that the ghosts or the spirits are doing feels like it doesn't really quite match up with what some of the motivations they're kind of trying to fit in with the other part of the plot. And honestly, the ghost thing in general just felt kind of like weird. Like, obviously, when it was just someone invisible attacking someone, and what I thought the episode was going to be at that point is that, okay, they're going to start investigating, there maybe be a second attack or something. But it never really felt like there was any consistency to it. It felt like we kind of ignored it for a long time while we were just investigating the patients and the fact that they were very healthy for people who had Alzheimer's. They should be in a much worse state, but they're doing very normal things. In fact, one of them's painting stuff and doing a really good job of it. They're all a lot more coherent than you'd expect, and especially since we find out that they used to not be coherent, that they've actually gotten better because of this experimental drug. Or is it the experimental one that the doctor's giving them, or is it the thing that the janitor or the orderly's giving them sneakily? Which some of them are addicted to because they like feeling smart again. All that like kind of like was much less interesting. And then by the time that we do actually get another attack, which is when one of the orderlies is pushed out the window, it's like another, we're halfway or so through the episode by that point. It feels like we've muddied it so much that I couldn't even get excited by that anymore. And then we start seeing like the little old woman who's played by Frances Bay, who's a face that I recognize from other things from this time period. She like starts like we get things from her POV where she can actually see the spirits moving around, and that just made it feel a bit hokey. It was creepy and mysterious when it was just an invisible force is doing something. And if they'd stuck to that and just maybe focused on that happening, I think that could have made for a really exciting, creepy episode. Instead, we got her looking at spirits, and it's like, okay, well, did only one spirit like attack the woman in the opening? Was that just one really bad guy who did that? Was that like multiple spirits doing that? Obviously, physical strength is meaningless if they're spirits. Presumably, they just have as much strength as either they want or however much each spirit has. Like, the fact that they were 70, 80 years old before they died, it probably is irrelevant at that point, I imagine. But yeah, there was some weird things about the different sides of this plot that don't really sync up very well. And then the spirits go away at the end, and it seems to be because the last person who had a lot of this mushroom in their system gets injected with like a counter agent because he starts to die, and that seems to be what makes the spirits leave, indicating that maybe because too much of this stuff had been taken, more than what the orderly had wanted to give them, but they'd been, one of the old guys had been stealing it, and he was taking more than he should have, and that was like strengthening the spirit's connection to the world or something. Yeah. Yeah, all of that was a little bit rough to sort of like get through. There is some fun stuff here or there. Like, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense necessarily, some of it, but there's a big set piece towards the end where the nurse, the victim from the start of the episode, and Mulder are trapped in a bathroom at the end by the spirits, and the water's filling up the room. They can't turn it off, so like they're basically drowning. There's a countdown till they drown. But what's so weird about that, though, is that I don't think that a regular door would actually keep in the water enough to actually have it fill up like a tank. I feel like that's not physically correct. That said, though, it's still fun. Like, they did a big, what felt like a very kind of expensive and elaborate moment for an episode of The X-Files, which is when the door finally gets open when the water was completely full. We get this, rush of water coming out into the hallway, and like the entire hallway is flooded. That actually looked like a pretty big fun, like, stunt, I guess we'll call it, a big practical effect. They actually went to the effort to do that, and it was a fun moment for what it was. I think it's a bit murky because I think they're going for this idea that eventually the spirits want to go after Mulder and Scully because they're getting close to discovering things or ruining what they've got going. But it never really feels like the plot turns enough to actually make it feel like, oh no, now they're hunting Mulder and Scully. It's more just like there's one moment where they're kind of looking at Scully, and then this moment where they trap Mulder in the room. But even when they trap Mulder in the bathroom, it kind of feels like, is he actually the target, or is this just happenstance because he went in to try and protect the nurse who was already being attacked by that point? And they try and like murky the background by saying that the nurse like had a history of trying to like get out of her job. So there's a lot of like scenes early on where like the administrator of the place is like, hey, I have trouble believing her claims here because she's tried to claim, being sick or ill or something to get out of work before. So they're kind of the opinion that maybe this is all just a ruse to like get out of having to go to work. But she has all the physical injuries, she has all the things that would go along with her story. It's just that she was trapped in a room with seemingly no one else being there. It almost does feel like if you made this episode now, it would probably, or at least potentially, be much better and maybe actually say something about the victim not being believed. Like it felt like, I've said a lot of things talking about how Mulder's dismissive, the people she works with don't really believe her, and she's frustrated because she can't provide physical evidence other than her own injuries. So, she can't provide any kind of like DNA from the attacker. Because of that, no one's going to really believe that anything happened. You could really do something with that in a modern story where you really try and explore this idea of like, it's one thing that the victims of sexual assault are not believed as it is. It's already a problem, but you take that and turn it up to like 11 by having a supernatural force be the culprit, so that it's even more, it's literally unbelievable in the sense that you question, like, is it even possible? Because you don't believe in spirits, you don't believe in invisible people, whatever's causing it. And that's something, funnily enough, that the modern Invisible Man movie did a lot with, right? That was a really good movie in 2020 with Elizabeth Moss and Lee Winnell directing. That was a really good sort of take on that, where it took that and used it to talk about how victims aren't believed when they're in abusive relationships or attacked. This feels like, well, it feels like every single part of it, at least in the first half of the episode, is going in that direction to talk about that subject. It ultimately feels like it has absolutely nothing to say about it. It feels like it is just there for plot. It's just there to get to the next thing. And then once we're on to, there's mushrooms in the basement, this orderly's giving them to the patients, and there's ghosts going around, it's more about all that stuff. And the fact that she was sexually assaulted in the opening scene almost feels like it was forgotten about by the time you get to the last like third of the episode. Like, there's no resolution really for that character. There's nothing that really kind of gives any sense of peace by the end or anything like that. And I know obviously the show wants to do like a creepy, we'll never know the true answers of what happened there kind of thing. But I feel like, for as unsatisfying as it is, I think the audience do know that, though. It's one thing for Scully to say that in her report because she didn't see the spirits walking around, but we did. So for us, it's just kind of like, very little was really resolved other than the fact that it's over, right? The ghosts are no longer there because this drug's no longer been given out. These mushrooms aren't being given to them anymore. So it's wrapped up. The crisis is over, but no one in the crisis has been able to get any sense of closure or resolution to it. It's a little unsatisfying at the end as well because of that. Like I say, though, my bigger things is, one, that it felt like a really cool premise in the opening, but then it just became something else, pretty much, that was a bit more hokey. That's problem number one, but problem number two is how some of the other things of kind of dated, particularly Mulder's dismissal of what's going on when that specifically feels out of character given how he is when anything else is going on. He's ready to just throw in the towel and go home. It'd be one thing if he did this every so often, but he's literally never been that way. And then the second it's about a victim of a rape, he's like, yeah, there's nothing we can do, let's just move on. Felt really, left a bad taste, I'll say. And then the stuff with like the employee with the mushrooms and all the general kind of, it's a trope in horror movies where, you have like, a bunch of Americans or whoever go to another country and it's like, oh, the culture here is weird, they're into voodoo or they're into spiritual stuff, or maybe it's that they've got a neighbor like in the US or whatever, and they're a foreigner and they've got their spiritual stuff with them. Like, it's such a trope in horror at this point that it is one that I'm personally really sick of, because it feels like, we always end up doing it. But I think in particular this case, the fact that it just kind of felt like they're going for this thing where he's supposed to have done this out of kindness because he thinks it's the right thing to do, but he must clearly know that he's breaking some kind of rule by doing it, that he's actually doing something very illegal by like making his own substance and giving it to the patients. And that's pointed out by the woman in charge of the home, but it never felt like the character... It felt like he was almost surprised by this, like he didn't realize he was doing anything wrong. It would be one thing if he knew that, okay, I'm breaking the rules, but I think it's the right... I'm making a stance. I think it's the right thing to do, despite the fact that I'm heavily breaking the rules. And I'm not saying that he didn't know that he was breaking the rules at all, but it felt like his defense really summed up to, well, I didn't realize I was doing anything wrong because this is how my people do things. And it felt like a really tired trope to me, that it made it really difficult to engage with the character or anything. Really, really rough episode by the time it gets to the end. I think it's got a really cool opening few minutes. I think it does a good job of setting up a really intriguing horror story that the characters can come in and investigate. But sadly, once they start investigating, it just keeps adding in these other elements that just took away the mystique. And that would be one thing, but it didn't even feel like it was that focused on the initial attack and like, okay, will they attack again? Is this a series of attacks? It felt like everything they did after this was relatively at random, or at least they're trying to pivot into, no, this is revenge and all the employees that the spirits didn't like when they were alive. But that doesn't really give a satisfying reason for the opening crime, because the opening crime is so heinous that, like, even if she's a bit bitchy to the guest, it doesn't justify that. It doesn't even remotely come close to feeling like a suitable answer for it. So, yeah, it just, yeah, rough episode. I will say, yeah, I think that's me. I will say actually, the old guy who is dirty in the opening scene, he says a couple of dirty things to the nurse. He ends up dying like a third into the episode, but he's got a couple of scenes worth mentioning. He's got one where Mulder and Scully come to see him, and he's just out of his bath, so he basically flashes them his junk to prove that it doesn't work. At least that was the implication. And the reaction on Scully, and again, this was one of the scenes where it felt like if they were really trying to say something about the treatment of women here, because he starts basically making like, hey, Agent Scully, if I said you were a beautiful woman and I would like to get to know you, would that be offensive? And it feels a little disingenuous given the things that he was saying. But he was basically complaining earlier on in the scene that, oh, everything's too woke now. You can't tell a woman how you feel. It really felt like, okay, that part feels just the same these days. He didn't use that word, obviously, but it feels very in line with that. The reason why I wanted to bring him up, though, is not even that scene, although it's amusing for the performances in Scully and Mulder's reactions to him. But it's a scene where he's with the other old guy who's taken a lot of the pills with the mushrooms in them. He, at one point, he says the phrase "back off" really angry, and I swear it sounded like he said "F off." It really did. I went back and played it like 3 times, and it's a sort of thing where I'm convinced if this episode was like put on YouTube or something, the automated system would think he swore, because it really sounded like an F-bomb. Obviously it wasn't. They weren't airing an F-bomb in a random throwaway episode of X-Files in the mid-90s on Fox, but it really sounded like he dropped an F-bomb. So I thought I'd mention that as well. Anyway, that's my thoughts on this episode. Let's see what we've got coming next time. Hopefully one better, because, the last one was kind of entertaining in a crazy way. This one, I think, was just a bit of a big letdown by the time it got going. Next episode is called Aubrey, and here's the description via IMDb. A pregnant policewoman experiences visions that lead her to the remains of 2 FBI agents who went missing in the 1940s while on the trail of a serial killer that later got caught. The killings begin again, but the only suspect is now 77. Very interesting. I am also noticing here that Terry O'Quinn is in this next episode. That's cool. I am a fan of Lost, so I know Terry O'Quinn very well from that show. So excited to see him pop up. The premise sounds interesting. It's definitely not the first time we've had like a series. I mean, hell, if you go back to was Squeeze and that character, part of that story was that murders happened like 30 years ago and 60 years ago, and they go and talk to the old detective to get information. It feels like they're taking that part of that and sort of expanding it into its own kind of story here. This idea of killings from long ago and them starting back up. So yeah, I'm intrigued. We'll see how this goes. But yeah, let me know what you thought of this week's episode in the comments. Like, subscribe, all the usual things. You can support everything over in patreon.com/MaleFuzzTV. Thank you once again for joining me. I always appreciate it. Keep watching TV. Have you got any vanilla?